Well, everyone should have had their webinar emails.
Okay, we've got a couple of attendees who have arrived.
Oh, yay. That's Nick and Stephen. Yeah. Hmm. Very odd that they didn't get the email fired out. Here we go. Oh, Carl, these are all familiar faces anyway. Let me have a look at how many people came to the last one. We had 50 people pop into the last one out of 142 registrations, and 76 people have visited thus far. So that's pretty good. That's over 50%. The problem is we've had for the main one over 2,900 signups and 300 turnouts. So that's a bit of a pain. I'll fire out a tweet as well, just to get a few more people in from the BTN account.
Cool. Hi, Stephen, Nick, and Carl. We're just trying to get the rest of the people in.
Sorry, everyone will be able to hear an echo back. I'm just going to put my sound down because I've got everything on speaker. Unless you want to listen to yourself, I guess. Alexander Manos, and God, our names take up so many letters for the tweet. Send that one out from. Oh, can I tweet from Ben's account? No, never mind. Do 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 do. We have five attendees, but two of them are us. Never mind. Oh, cool.
What do you want to do, Rich? Can I make a slow start, or?
That'd be best to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just hammer social media to send people in while you chat.
Okay.
That'd be the best, I think.
Alrighty. So welcome, Nick, Carl, and Stephen. So thanks for coming on, guys. Just so you're aware, if you're not already, Rich has his talk immediately after this one. He's going to be talking all things sort of insulin, glycogen storage, etc. But we are going to spend the next sort of 50 minutes or so introducing the concepts of functional medicine, talking about some of the fundamental principles, and then really introduce you guys to the Advanced Academy through giving you a gist of kind of what it entails, and also some of the content that you would expect to get from it. So this is what it's going to be like a little bit tonight, and what it is like every Monday night in the Advanced Academy, really. Partly just because we only have an hour to go through, obviously, a huge amount of information. So today I want to really try and give you guys a good vibe of what functional medicine is and kind of what you could expect from the Academy. So there are three sort of key things really we're going to cover: the principles and concepts. We'll kind of discuss how to think like a functional medicine practitioner. Most personal trainers and nutritionists already do. A lot of it comes from sort of common sense to an extent, but there are a couple of key documents as well that we're going to be going through just to help us with that kind of approach. And then, as I just mentioned, we're going to introduce the academy itself as well. So there are 5 things that we're going to go through to help us kind of get an understanding of what functional medicine is. The first 2 kind of go hand in hand, and they're all very much interrelated. But we can essentially call it an evolution in the practice of medicine, partly because we can say that it better addresses the healthcare needs of the 21st century. And I think one of the big reasons behind that is it's much more equipped to support those with complex chronic disease than it is to support those with acute disease. It's very much a proactive, preventative type approach as well. So you have the tools in the toolkit, so to speak, to support clients and a type of disease, shall we say, which is just skyrocketing, as we know, in the modern world. This quote gives us kind of an indication of point 3 in regards to what functional medicine is. It comes from Geoffrey Bland. As you may well be aware, he's kind of essentially the founder of functional medicine. And his quote is, "Disease is a delusion. Your heart disease is not the same as mine. Everyone with type 2 diabetes is not just like everyone else with type 2 diabetes. These so-called diseases are dysfunctions of each individual's physiological functioning. They are due to varied causes, and they demand treatment approaches as different from one another as are the individuals." So because we need to appreciate that there are so many underlying mechanisms that can contribute to the same diagnosis, we really need to stay focused on the concept that functional medicine is a patient-orientated approach. We need to focus on the client and their story and their journey to be able to effectively support them and help them restore their health to whatever possibility that is, which is sometimes very against what happens from a conventional medicine perspective, which we'll touch on later as well. But we can kind of say that from a conventional perspective, we often take more of a disease-orientated approach, i.e. we look for a cluster of symptoms that give us a diagnosis. Once we've got the diagnosis, we can consider what medication we can prescribe to support the client, without really thinking as much as we should about the patient story and obviously just the underlying mechanisms for that individual. And this is a little sort of comic book sketch that helps us with point 4. You're not ill yet, Mr. Blenzel, but you've got potential. And this is the fact that we need to address the whole person, not just isolated set of symptoms or just an isolated set of laboratory markers. If they've gone for a blood draw and they're kind of flirting with being outside the reference range from even a conventional perspective, then those are some little flags that are being raised that we need to consider. And although that comic book sketch is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I have had several clients where this has essentially happened to them. They've gone to a health practitioner, they've had some bloods or something like that drawn, the test results have come back, and they're very much on the threshold of having some form of abnormality in their physiology. And they've basically been told, come back in 6 months, the reference ranges may well be out of range then, and we can give you a drug to support you. There's no concept that an aspect of lifestyle could be needed to prevent that marker from their blood draw or stool analysis, whatever it may be, from returning that to a much more healthy level. On that note, we obviously also need to appreciate that conventional reference ranges are quite often a lot broader than the ones used in the functional medicine world, partly because we're talking about optimizing our client's health rather than just kind of preventing certain symptoms. And then there are a few things for us to consider before we think about that 5th point as well. And I know this almost goes off topic a little bit, but I think it's such a cornerstone to functional medicine. And I think it's such a cornerstone for all of us working, whatever term you want to be using. And there's some really great research out there which kind of ties in with this. So, I mean, I just put the client needs to be in the driver's seat here. We know through literature that there is a positive influence of quality communication on health outcomes. The ability of the practitioner to be able to communicate to their client in an effective manner and in a way that the client understands is huge when it comes to the clinical outcome. So we need to ensure that the client feels empowered and understands what is going on through that journey. And as a result, also, as a practitioner, we need to recognize and acknowledge the patient's experience of illness. Again, research has shown us that the more actively involved the patient in making decisions about their treatment, the better the clinical outcome as well. So we're essentially in the passenger seat supporting the client, giving them different options or different routes that they can go down. But ultimately, we need to ensure that they're the one making the final decision, because no one knows themselves better than themselves. And we also should be paying attention to our clients' beliefs. And we can do this in a pre-consult telephone consultation. You can bring it into the initial consult that you do with a client. There are different strategies that we can incorporate this in. But we need to also just be aware that perceived self-efficacy is a cognitive mediator that determines coping with illness. So the client's belief in their ability to cope with their specific condition, disease, or problem is actually an important part of the puzzle in their recovery. So there are things, very simple things we can do to start to tap into this. For example, we can ask our clients around their beliefs. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it for you to change? On the same scale, how confident are you that you can change? And the reason why this can be so powerful is because if you have someone who thinks that their goal of, let's say, reducing their blood pressure is 10 out of 10. It's one of the most important things in their life at this point. But their confidence in being able to achieve that is, let's just say, a 1 or a 2. There is no point just continuing that consultation and giving them a nutritional and lifestyle program to support them based on all the research you're aware of from a moderating blood pressure. What we need to do is get an understanding of why their confidence is where it is. So we could ask them why they're not a 1 or a 0 if they're a 2, for example. So what are they doing, or what do they know already which is giving them some level of confidence? And we could also ask them what needs to happen for them to become a 3 or a 4 plus if they're something like a 2. And that then gets them almost stepping out and having a little reflection session in regards to what needs to happen for me to have more confidence, and therefore obviously have a much greater chance of improving the health. So those are some very simple things that we need to consider in our clients, because the client's in the driver's seat. We can ask them how much control they think they have over their symptoms. You know, a lot of people with chronic gut issues, is just an example, sometimes feel really helpless. They're reacting to anything they're eating. They're almost lost in regards to what to eat. Some clients end up, therefore, on very low-calorie diets because they're just trying anything to improve their symptoms. So we need to, again, with our communication, with the knowledge and translating it in the right way, we need to kind of reinforce and improve sometimes our clients' beliefs so they have more control and they have more understanding. And then obviously social support, as we all know, is a really important part of it. So with that kind of knowledge base, there's a really important 5th point to what is functional medicine, and that is practitioners spend time with patients, listening to their stories, looking at interactions between genetic, environmental, and lifestyle factors. And that's why, you know, conventional medicine just isn't quite going to be able to do it, because practitioners are just limited in the time they have with clients. So functional medicine, I think, is a great complementary option alongside the conventional medicine route, because practitioners generally will have that time to listen to the patient's story and to understand that journey. And there is a 6th point as well, which is it's really about supporting the unique expression of health and vitality for each individual. So really there, for me, it's talking about optimal health. It's not getting our clients to a point where they're saying they're feeling okay. It's getting them to a point where they have an abundance of energy and vitality. Now, obviously, it is down to the client or the patient. And one thing I do think we often get wrong in the fitness industry, or just as practitioners essentially, is we sort of install our beliefs and values on our clients and think they want the same thing as us. So not everyone's after kind of the abundant energy and vitality that a lot of us are. So again, we need to have a clear understanding ourselves of the client's vision for what their goals and expectations are. Why do we need it? We've already mentioned a few of these. There is a sharp increase in the number of people struggling with complex chronic disease, which the current system just isn't really sort of targeting. It's more orientated towards acute care. We know that there's a big gap in the research and the way practitioners practice. We shouldn't just say doctors really there. We're all in the same boat here. And there are different statistics I've been told and read, anywhere from sort of 10 to 40 years. So what they're saying there is essentially research papers coming out today could take up to, let's say, 20 years to become common practice in clinical practice. So there is this gap that we need to try and reduce. And again, I think a lot of trainers, a lot of nutritionists are in a much better position to consider this because we have more time than a lot of doctors who are just back to back throughout the day. A lot of docs who I've spoken to at the conferences, etc., you know, they come to these amazing conferences, learn a lot, go away, and are just too busy to start to adapt some of the knowledge that they've taken in, because it takes obviously quite a while to process a lot of this as well. So we need to almost make sure that we've got time put aside to try and stay on top of the latest research. And that's definitely an argument for specializing in a certain area, because obviously it's impossible to stay on top of everything. And at the same time, medical physicians often just aren't trained around underlying causes. You know, more and more literature tells us that in medical schools, their lectures are orientated towards being able to diagnose and then knowing which medication to prescribe. And that's not a bash at doctors, that's just a bash at the institution and the way it's being pushed, essentially. So how can we relay this to our clients in a kind of simplistic way? Well, there's a very simplistic way which the Functional Medicine Institute created called the Functional Medicine Tree. There are lots of different analogies you could use, I'm sure. Their general approach is to kind of describe, you know, functional medicine, lifestyle medicine, whatever you want to call it, nutritional therapy, as working from the roots up, whereas conventional medicine works in the branches and the leaves. So let's say you have a set of symptoms, you go to your GP, that cluster of symptoms may be related to your cardiovascular system, just an example, and you end up seeing a cardiologist. You could go and see an endocrinologist, a gastroenterologist. We've done a beautiful thing of understanding the body from a reductionist perspective. We've broken it down into its component parts. This next step, which I think functional medicine are really trying to push essentially, is now integrating that knowledge back up again. So we need to appreciate that a lot of these consultants don't fully appreciate how one biological system interacts with another. Whereas a functional medicine route is going to the roots of the tree. It's taking into consideration the quality of the soil. And the quality of the soil obviously is going to refer to someone's sleep, their nutrition, their relationships, their stress management, their environment, their hydration, etc. And if you take into consideration all of those components, on top of that start to take into consideration any genetic predispositions, single nucleotide polymorphisms that you may or may not be aware of, obviously from a testing perspective, along with what we call antecedents, triggers, and mediators, we can then get an understanding of which of these biological systems, the gut, the cardiovascular system, etc., may need the most support. So this is kind of a magnified approach for you here as well. So then you get your signs and symptoms after these kind of clinical imbalances, which could be dysbiosis, it could be related to phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification, etc., which lead to the constellation of symptoms and seeing your consultant. So going back to those terms that you may not have heard before, I know I certainly hadn't before getting into this area. Antecedents, triggers, and mediators are three key things that we're trying to understand with each and every client to understand their journey and to understand where we need to go with our programs or protocols. So antecedents are things that will predispose an individual to a particular condition. And those antecedents could be anything from single nucleotide polymorphisms to something related to the pregnancy. They could have been preterm, for example, or born at a low birth weight, which we know predisposes people to metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease, for example. We have triggers, which, as the name just suggests, are sort of discrete events that trigger the onset of that condition or the symptom. And mediators are things that keep it going. So the ongoing physiological processes that just keep that going. So when we think about this, it's not black or white. So for example, we need to be aware that a period of chronic stress could be an antecedent. It could be it could predispose someone to something. A trigger is something that also could be stress. So a period of acute stress, for example, could lead to the onset of that symptom. And then a mediator could be stress as well, because that stress could become ongoing and therefore prevent that person from improving their health. Now we have two documents to kind of really help us from this perspective. So when we're collecting our information, there are two documents we can kind of complete to help us understand our client's journey, but also use those same two documents to relay that information back to our clients. So the functional matrix is just almost like a mind map that you can just tally down some of that information. So on the left, obviously, you've got your suspected antecedents, triggers, and mediators. You've got lifestyle factors that we obviously want to be gathering information about: sleep and relaxation, exercise and movement, nutrition, stress, relationships, and then the biological systems. And Christy Hughes, who's a faculty member at the IFM, kind of has this saying, where's the ink? So if you're completing this matrix, top right part of the matrix, and a lot of your note taking seems to be under assimilation, which is your digestive system, then that may be a little suggestion that we need to go and support that digestive system, even if they've come to see you for something that you may have initially considered to be unrelated to someone's digestive health. Communication is the endocrine system. Transport is obviously the cardiovascular system. Biotransformation and elimination is the detoxification pathways. Energy could be related to Krebs and the electron transport chain, and defense and repair is that kind of immune inflammatory system as well. And that's a really nice way of getting an understanding of where your program is going with the clients. So this gives you kind of an idea of things that we need to be considering. You kind of got the triggering events. I often describe this to clients as kind of the domino effect. We want to really try and get to that first domino that fell over, because if we only go to the fourth or fifth domino and try and bring that back up, then we're going to be fighting a losing battle, essentially. So we've got a couple of questions that I'll just get to now, because they're probably appropriate for this point. The first one, thought I'd write a few questions now before they fall out of my head. These aren't specific to where you are on the slides. There we go. When you work with someone and they've been getting passed around the NHS but collecting results from various tests, are you interested in these, or are you likely to order a new batch based on your assessment? I'm always interested in the current data that a client's got, because it was free from the NHS. So anything we can get from the NHS, I think, is worth it. As long as we can get copies of the results so we can interpret it from a functional perspective, that's not a problem. If we then need to go down a functional laboratory path where the client is going to unfortunately have to invest in the test, then we've got those options as well. And to be honest, 9 times out of 10, if not more, we have to go down that path, because some of the markers that we want to investigate, the doctor or sometimes the endocrinologist, gastroenterologist just won't agree to get tested. And the second question was, for an individual who doesn't have any sign of illness and just wants to chase optimum health and improve things, what are you likely to suggest they try to improve? What are you most likely to have them test to highlight an area for improvement? So that's obviously a really big question. The first part is it's going to be individualized. So we go through our matrix, we go through this document here, the functional timeline, to see they may be in relatively good health, but is there anything through that 60, 90-minute initial consult where you've been gathering information that gets you thinking that maybe you want to go somewhere? If you still don't really have any data there or any suspicions that anything's going on, there are various things you could consider. I often go to the optimal nutrition evaluation test, or the NutriVal, which will assess things like gut function, nutrient status, oxidative stress markers, liver function, amino acid status, neurotransmitter metabolites, and gives you a little bit more information around kind of gut function through other markers as well. So there are kind of some what I call MOT tests out there that are possible to complete for people who want to try and optimize their health and don't seem to have any signs, symptoms, or diseases. So I hope that kind of clarifies those two. Obviously, any other questions, guys, just pop them in and I'll get to them when it's kind of as appropriate as possible. But that second document, this functional timeline that you see now, is also going to be really important. And again, this is something that you can certainly relay back to clients. Sometimes nothing major comes of it. Sometimes there are real eureka moments. So with this one, what we see is we can ask questions about the family history, about preconception. You know, what were the parents' nutrition plans like? What were their activity levels like? Anything we can. Often there's not much information that we can get from here because clients often just aren't aware too much of what was going on there. But then we have our prenatal markers as well. So this could be anything obviously to do with the intrauterine environment in the pregnancy. It could be related to the mother's health. If there was an infection during pregnancy, for example, we know that can increase the risk of autism. There are all sorts of different things that we need to be aware of in regards to the pregnancy. Knowing what the birth weight was and what the term of birth was, were they preterm or full term, gives us information in regards to what kind of diseases they may be predisposed to. And then we can just go through the timeline, ask them about the first few years of life. Were there many courses of antibiotics and infections? What was the nutrition like during primary school, secondary school, etc.? What were their teenage years like? Have they moved country? Have they moved house? Have there been bereavements, etc.? The more information we can get there, the better. So this is a really useful way of kind of structuring your information gathering in your initial consult with a client. You know, start with the current, see, you know, why have you come to see me today? See where they are in their journey, and then what I normally do is just go back to the start and then work up to the present. I think the beauty of this is you can also go into the future. So once you've done all of that and you want to go through some motivational interviewing type stuff, you can actually ask your clients, well, what does your future timeline want to look like for you? You know, what is your health like in 6 months, 12 months, 3 years, 5 years, etc. And that can be very powerful and motivating for the clients, obviously, as well. Okay, so moving on to the Academy. We're just going to have a quick journey through some of the kind of information that we can go through. So the Academy starts with an introductory talk and then essentially we go into transgenerational disease and prenatal programming. So we take a look at what information research is out there in regards to the family history and the health of the grandparents and the parents in regards to our client. So for example, there's a wealth of information from animal studies, and there's now a growing amount of information from human studies that the health of not only our parents but our grandparents can potentially influence our health late in life as well. And this partly comes from the Dutch winter famine of 1944, I think it was, when the Nazis put an embargo on some communities. And what they found was that basically they were significantly malnourished and under-eating. For some reason, they just have amazing records of that time. They kept amazing data. So we have used that, and we've been tracking the families in the generation since, and we've seen an increase in all sorts of different conditions, in particular cardiovascular disease and metabolic diseases. So the more information we can get about our clients' parents and grandparents, the better. Obviously, just the general family history can be useful from that perspective as well. Absolutely. So Ricky's put, so we look at past and present factors to influence the future. I think that's a really nice way to look at it, and it's a really important part of the puzzle sometimes. You know, I now frequently look at or ask around clients' birth weight, for example, because that will give you an indication of what's going on potentially with predispositions to various diseases, etc. During pregnancy, we also know that there are various factors for us to consider. For example, we mentioned that if the mother has an infection during pregnancy, there is literature that suggests that can increase the risk of autism, and it can certainly influence other factors as well. So we know that in that sort of situation where the maternal immune system is upregulated, that we're going to get synthesis of, or extra synthesis, for want of a better term, of things like cytokines and glucocorticoids. And those are able to influence various developmental pathways in that intrauterine environment and predispose an individual or increase the risk of certain conditions. So we go through prenatal programming, we spend an hour or so, one of the weeks of the academy, looking at this sort of information because it can be so valuable to some of our more complex clients. And for me, you know, personal experience shows that when you can relate some of this back to your client and you can help them connect the dots, they find it just brilliant to finally get some form of explanation about why they have been struggling for so long. So Stephen Miller has just put, open this up on YouTube to watch the full screen, went back to see the questions, and it went back to the start of the webinar. Any suggestions? Sorry, Stephen, I have no idea on that front. If you're watching it on YouTube, you should be able just to fast forward. That may be a recording of Sunday evening's one. I'm not quite sure. We then move on, and then we talk about things like breast milk. So this is just an example paper, and things that we just need to be aware of when we're discussing some of these concepts with our clients, which is there is literature out there which discusses this concept of breast milk being contaminated with various chemicals. Now, that may not be an issue in certain instances, but as far as I'm aware, there's literature that shows us that the level of contaminants is a concern. So these are things that we need to consider. So it takes 3 months for the egg to be deployed and to develop and for conception. So often people will talk about recommending to clients a 3-month period before they start conceiving to optimize the client's health, to go through a little bit of a detox if you feel it's appropriate for that client, to optimize gut health. There was a paper that came out last month talking about dysbiosis and the potential influence that can have on pregnancy complications, for example. So I'm a huge believer that if we have clients coming to us for sort of fertility, etc., we need to sometimes have some quite big conversations with them and say, will you be happy to hold out 3+ months? And it may be longer depending on the health of that individual. And we can only obviously pass on the information and help them make the decision that's best for them at that point. And then we just go through. So the structure of the academy is going to change from the first time round. What we see with a lot of these conditions that we talk about, from inflammatory bowel disease and IBS to cognitive health and dementia to autoimmune conditions to cardiovascular disease, is there are some incredibly common underlying mechanisms and pathways that we come back to basically every single week. So the way forward, I think, is to get a real good understanding of these pathways to begin with. So when then we go through them in a little bit more detail, we're really kind of embedding that information on a good foundation. So this is a diagram that I used at the BTN conference last year, and it's kind of from the gut-brain axis talk that we do. And I think it's a really, really important concept for us to appreciate, especially with any of our cognitive or gut clients, so to speak. So the gut-brain axis is actually more than one pathway. We have a neurological pathway, the vagal nerve, or the vagus nerve communicates from the brain to the digestive tract. We have an immune pathway via cytokines, inflammatory molecules. We have an endocrine pathway, which is involving things like cortisol, but also we could put the sex hormones and thyroxine into here as well. And we have what I call a metabolic pathway, which are molecules synthesized by things like our gut microbiome or bacteria, neurotransmitters, and short-chain fatty acids as well that synthesize molecules that have the ability to influence our mood. And this is a huge area that's just bursting now in regards to how much information is coming out. We also know through literature that the vagus nerve can be cut in animal studies, and some of this information then doesn't materialize, which basically gives us confirmation that the vagal nerve is involved in the gut-brain axis. There's also information in regards to kind of cytokines, so it's a kind of a subclinical state of inflammation can also contribute to cognitive decline and neurodegeneration, either through the vagal nerve or through leaky parts of the blood-brain barrier. And if that happens, then we have various immune cells of the brain, such as microglia cells, that can then synthesize their own cytokines, and that's been shown to contribute to neurodegeneration, problems with neuroplasticity, etc. So it's a really, really huge area of research. There was a book last year that came out called Microbial Endocrinology, and that's well worth a purchase from Amazon. It's the most up-to-date resource we have there. Ricky has asked to zoom in on this for 2 seconds, so well, it should be possible. Hopefully that's zoomed in for you guys. It comes from a review from the journal Nature, and it really is a huge concept. So if any of you work with a lot of clients who have digestive imbalances, be it bloating, indigestion, constipation, diarrhea, etc., IBS type stuff, then considering the gut-brain axis is going to be really important. It might not be the first point of call we go to, but it's a nice simplistic way, I think, of thinking about this is a lot of clients with chronic gut issues have to really think about stress management. And it can take time for that to remodulate, as a lot of us are aware. And then we talk about the elderly. I mean, that's going to largely come from our cognitive talks, but there are specific things that we need to be considering with some of our more elder clients. This is just, again, kind of an example paper that discusses the benefits of probiotics and prebiotics. Obviously, getting easy to digest foods and nutrient status and nutrient dense food is incredibly important for this part of the timeline. So we kind of go through the academy from considering this kind of transgenerational perspective all the way through to old age and things that we may need to consider. And a lot of that is going to be around neurodegeneration. There's going to be some really interesting statistics coming out in regards to the diagnosis of, for example, Alzheimer's. So one paper that we reviewed last week thinks that at 2020, the number of people diagnosed is going to double every decade. And there are all sorts of reasons behind that. From a dementia perspective, inflammation, oxidative stress, and the gut microbiome seem to be really big areas of research at this point in time. So another question on this is, if you're approached by a client with a number of issues, how you decide what to deal with first. Again, you've just got to go back to your matrix and timeline. It's going to be individualized. It depends on what's going on in that individual. So it really is impossible to say. And this is why it can be quite frustrating, because it has to be on an individual basis, and therefore a lot of the time answers to these sorts of questions is it just depends on the individual. If there are gut issues, then you're always going to be wanting to consider that to begin with, but there may be things that you need to support alongside that. We know, for example, that certain hormones are quite important in the epithelial regeneration. So the cells on the lining of your digestive tract regenerates every 3 to 5 days. So we know that thyroxine, for example, is important in that process. But generally speaking, if there are digestive imbalances, then that's definitely one of the top priorities every single time. Because if someone's not able to digest their food effectively, they can't nourish their bodies, and that's going to inhibit the success of any other imbalance that may be there. But go back to the matrix, listen to the client. What are they saying to you about their journey? Where are the symptoms based? And then go from that perspective. And obviously, with that kind of approach, and as you gain more experience from that approach, you'll get an indication of where you need to be going on those sorts of with those sorts of clients. I'm sorry I can't be more useful from that perspective, though. So let's have a little look at the Academy now as well. We're going to take 3 slides from 3 talks, which I think are 3 very powerful slides in regards to this. So we have cardiovascular health, gastrointestinal health, and cognitive health. From a cardiovascular perspective, one of the nice ways for us to think about this is Dr. Mark Houston's quote, which is there are an infinite number of insults on the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessel, but there is a finite number of responses to those infinite insults. And those finite responses are inflammation, oxidative stress, and an immune response. Now, we can break those infinite insults into biomechanical and biochemical. Biomechanical can be things as simple as their blood pressure. Biochemical could be things from microbial, so bacterial type problems, to nutritional deficiencies, or to what we call sterile antigens. So all of these sorts of molecules, and there are over 400 in the literature now that we have, will activate various receptors on the lining of the blood vessel. We have what we call pattern recognition receptors, of which nod-like receptors and toll-like receptors, which are shown in your image, are some of those pattern recognition receptors. Now, when they get stimulated, shall we say, they can contribute to inflammation, oxidative stress, and an immune response. So when it comes to cardiovascular disease, you can see how it needs to be personalized. You can have someone with cardiovascular disease with an underlying mechanism which takes you back to the gastrointestinal tract. We know through literature, for example, that an H. pylori infection can increase high sensitivity C-reactive protein, a very strong inflammatory marker. And high sensitivity C-reactive protein has been strongly correlated with various imbalances in cardiovascular disease. And research has shown eliminate that, and then you can see an improvement in some of these markers. Now, the gold standard, or the optimal way to deal with this, essentially is to find out what that underlying mechanism is. It could be a microbial infection, it could be a nutritional deficiency, etc. If you aren't able to take that route, for example, if you, for whatever reason, can't get a test done looking at nutrient status or doing a stool analysis, etc., then the next best option is just to go after one of those finite responses. An anti-inflammatory diet, making sure the diet is packed full of antioxidants, and taking out any suspected food sensitivities is going to modulate the immune response, support or remodulate the state of oxidative stress, and remodulate, therefore, inflammation. And the similar story with our gastrointestinal talks. We have the same receptors lining the digestive tract that we just mentioned, toll-like receptors, nod-like receptors, and these have an influence on our immune status and this kind of mucosal immune system that we have in our digestive tract. So this is a slide that we use in the IBD talk when we're talking about inflammatory bowel disease. And we kind of go through the concept that there are various different cells along the lining of the digestive tract. The way I kind of say this to clients, if you imagine your digestive tract as the hose pipe, the inside of that pipe contains kind of like a gluey layer, and the pipe is made up of different types of cells. One of those cells is what we call an M cell, which looks a little bit like kind of a drawing of a cat here with the ears, but it's literally, it is shaped a bit like an M. And underneath the M, we have often something like a Peyer's patch or a mesenteric lymph node. So we basically have a real immunological site here, because the function of the M cell is to allow the translocation of various substances from the lumen or from the inside of the hose pipe so they can be sampled. And that can, in certain situations, lead to the triggering of a Th1, Th2, or Th17 response, basically an immune response. Now, we also have these dendritic cells, or dendrites, and they also sample products from the lumen. So if you see this dendritic cell here with the arms or the dendrites reaching out, those can actually reach out into the lumen, take a bacteria or a sample of food, so to speak, bring it in, and the dendritic cell will act as an antigen presenting cell, and it will present it in the mesenteric lymph node. And depending on what's going on and the status of the immune system, the status of the endocrine system, etc., that will then lead to some form of immune response. A Th17 response, we now know, is heavily correlated with autoimmune disease. So this pathway is incredibly important in IBD, but can be altered through various things. So vitamins A and vitamins D are incredibly important to various cells along this pathway, including dendritic cells and our Treg cells. So vitamin A supports this concept of oral tolerance, the ability of the immune system in the gut to distinguish friends from foe. And there are various other factors that we're starting to understand will impact on this sort of pathway or mechanism. We also know that the pathogenicity, or the disease-causing potential of, let's say, a microbe, is partly dependent on various components of systemic health, like hormonal health, like nutrient status. So this takes us back to antecedents, triggers, and mediators that we saw earlier. If someone picks up a parasitic infection in Egypt or wherever it may be, they come back, they have a stool test, they go through a program and get it eliminated. Have we actually asked ourselves why they picked it up in the first place? Was there a predisposition there? Was there a nutrient deficiency? Was there an endocrine problem, etc., that actually made them susceptible to a parasitic infection? Unless that's addressed through the program, then you haven't really helped that client long term. You've just improved the health in the short term. So we have to make sure that we're going to those underlying mechanisms to ensure that we optimize the health of our client, and what I call kind of improve the robustness of their physiology. And then we do a couple of talks on cognitive health. Same sort of principles apply. One of the most frequent underlying mechanisms that we're aware of in the literature at the moment is inflammation and its role in depression. So what we see here is a cell, and in the nucleus we have the DNA. NF-kappa B, which is that transcription factor, can have a real impact, obviously, on cytokine production. Those cytokines we mentioned earlier can activate brain function through the vagus nerve, or get through the blood-brain barrier, where they can have an impact on neurotransmitter pathways, the HPA axis, and therefore increasing glucocorticoids, which can then have, in the long term, an inflammatory effect rather than anti-inflammatory effect. Ricky's got a quick question on retinoic acid from vitamin A that is the main influence to gut health. Yeah, there's kind of a big debate. I was reading an article by Christopher Masterjohn yesterday that talks about vitamin A, vitamin D, and vitamin K2. But retinoic acids is essentially what we're looking for. And there's a lot of information coming out in regards to our ability to convert our carotenes from sort of plant-based foods into our preformed vitamin A. And some people say that a lot of us have a real reduced ability to do that. And therefore, the importance of cod liver oil or organ meats like liver becomes even more important to get our sort of most available form of vitamin A. So good question, Ricky. And, you know, if we're talking about that, if we're able to modulate the immune system, obviously that's going to have an impact on inflammation. Inflammation isn't initiated for no reason. So if you have a client who is inflamed, and let's say they've had a test from the doc and we know there's inflammation there, what we generally need to focus on is the underlying cause. Something is causing the immune system to react. They can't just be placed on anti-inflammatories thinking that that's going to do the job. And Dr. Roundtree, who's a brilliant lecturer, really charismatic and always very popular with the audience, he talks about 4 things, and he references it to rheumatoid arthritis. But as a kind of side note, I think it's true from just an immune inflammatory perspective. And that is, we need to consider food, we need to consider toxicity, heavy metals, for example. We need to consider bugs, so a bacterial problem. And we need to also consider stress. One of those 4 things is often at the root of the onset of inflammation. So if we optimize the diet, if we optimize the gut, if we optimize kind of nutrient status, then we're doing a huge favor to our clients, and we'll very likely see a considerable change to their inflammatory state. And there are some incredible case studies in regards to taking that kind of what we call systems biology based approach. It isn't focusing in on one thing, and it's actually saying, okay, well, let's support all these systems that we know very much communicate with each other: the gut, the endocrine system, the neurological system, the immune system, etc. But if you are interested from a cognitive perspective, then there are some great papers out there talking about inflammation and its role in cognition. Obviously, you can see here, if I zoom in again for you guys, you've got things like brain-derived nuclear factor, BDNF, which is involved in neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. You've got your serotonin pathways here. Imbalances in these sort of pathways can lead to depression. Now, often what you see in depressed clients is an upregulated HPA axis contributing to excess levels of cortisol. If that is the case with a client, if that's prolonged, as you guys know, that can contribute to cortisol resistance. So you can end up with a kind of an insulin resistant state, but cortisol. That's going to potentially contribute to a inflammatory environment because the cells aren't responding to the cortisol. So you have potentially high levels of cortisol in blood or saliva when you test, but actually insufficient levels within the cell where obviously physiology is altered. So it can get incredibly complex when you start to think that actually cellular sensitivity can really mask some of our results or tests that we do. So I hope that's kind of given you some information. I want those 3 sides are obviously there for you to go away and have a think if you're interested in any of those 3 areas, but just to give you an idea of where we go in the academy. Now, all 3 of those, obviously, we spend a minimum of 1 hour. When the gut, I think we spend 4 weeks talking about sort of digestive health, looking at things like the gut-brain axis for a talk, looking at inflammatory bowel disease for a talk. We do an initial digestive talk where we kind of look at the fundamentals and the physiology and pathophysiology of it all, because there are some real key things that we need to be considering from that perspective. If you aren't aware and you are interested, the Advanced Academy is at the moment a 10-month course. We introduce all the key concepts to functional medicine, and we really kind of hammer home all of these underlying mechanisms that we need to be aware of. We do talk a reasonable amount about testing as well. I'm currently trying to see whether we can arrange some form of sort of scheme whereby you guys can order testing sort of via me, but essentially support your client without necessarily having to get me too involved. We can essentially do consults one-to-one where I can relay information back to the students of the academy, for example. It will certainly increase your ability to deal with lots of different clients, especially those with complex chronic disease. And over a 10-month period, you definitely will get just a good understanding and be able to kind of answer these sorts of questions that have come up in regards to, where should I be going with a client with X, Y, or Z? Go back to what we said at the very beginning. It's a patient-centered approach. So listen to their story, get an understanding of where those symptoms are coming from. If it's to do with inflammation of the immune system, we're going back to 4 fundamental factors for us to consider at least as our first point of call. So the Advanced Academy starts tomorrow at 10 a.m. The first lecture or talk isn't till the following Wednesday. So emails, I think, are sort of going out tomorrow morning for sign up if you are interested. It's obviously taught online via webinars, 1 hour every week. It's taught and supported by me. You get access to a members area. There is a forum where we can discuss cases and clients, which really obviously just help with that kind of learning experience. So we have that there for all of us to enjoy. You get your folder and you get access to examine.com if you aren't already using that. So we also are in the sort of process of just developing some things for you guys on the academy. So GP templates that you can post or give your clients to give to your doctors, so you can request testing done through the GP. Various questionnaires to help from a functional medicine perspective, so you can kind of just guarantee that you're taking the right approach in the information gathering part of the journey with a client, and various clinic docs and protocols to support you guys as well. And then anything is, as always, it's your academy. So anything else that you think would be beneficial, we will obviously do our best to support you as well. And then there are dozens and dozens of articles and links, etc., that obviously go out to the people each week to support their learning. So that's it for this evening, folks. There are some questions that have come up. Sorry, I went away from the chat box just to see who was here. So we have Nick. Just want to say thank you, Alex. Really enjoyed the session and learned a huge amount. Oh, thank you, Nick. Much appreciated. Ricky's asked how flexible is the timing and the timing of the webinars. So the learning is unbelievably flexible. You know, you're all just independent learners, essentially. The webinars are recorded, so you can listen to it at any point in the week. So it really is 100% independent, flexible learning. You know, I'm here to help you as much as I can. So the timing will be 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. on a Wednesday evening. But as I say, they're recorded. At the moment, we kind of get about 50% of students turning up in the evening. The others just listen to it in their own time. Pleasure, Doug. Glad you enjoyed it. So Ricky, that's kind of some of the logistics from that perspective. If any of you other guys have any other questions, do feel free to find me on social media, and you can drop me an email or a message if you have any personal questions, or if anything that you think of after we finish today. I appreciate often questions come up once you've had time to reflect a little bit on this. But hopefully I will see some of your names and faces in the Advanced Academy that starts tomorrow, but ultimately next week. And as I say, I hope you've enjoyed this evening, guys, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Pleasure, Ricky. Glad you enjoyed it. Pleasure, Carl.